Ronald Reagan issued his great challenge.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
No one imagined the Warsaw Pact, communism, and the Soviet Union itself would all come tumbling down. Versace and Gucci replaced Marx and Lenin. And a dancing, intoxicated president symbolized Russia's decline. By the time the Kremlin sobered up, NATO had devoured Russia's former East European satellites and was biting into chunks of its former Soviet republics. Surrounded, Russia lashed out, invading neighboring Georgia and putting America on notice. With a defiant Russia back on the world stage, we ask, is this the beginning of a new Cold War? Hello and welcome to Moscow. The United States and Russia possess 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. So when the old nemesis start once again behaving like potential adversaries, the world has much to worry about. Nowadays, tension is centered around the area stretching from Western Europe all the way to the Russian borders, where America is extending its strategic influence by expanding NATO and erecting missile systems. Stephen Cole, who attended the last NATO conference in Bucharest, visited one of those contentious states, the Ukraine, and filed this report.
It used to be so much simpler. There were the bad guys, and then there were the good guys. When the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, the battle lines were dismantled and much of the equipment was left behind to rust. The Cold War was over, wasn't it? Everyone was optimistic, but after 8 years of erratic rule under Boris Yeltsin, Russia sobered up. New President Vladimir Putin described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, but he put a brave face on it. Putin palled around with Bush, trying to build some sort of alliance. Their wives got into the PR act. Bush even endorsed Putin for his second run at the presidency, but the relationship went nowhere. Fast forward to the NATO summit held in Bucharest this year. If America wanted to provoke Russia, they succeeded in doing so. Dick Cheney invited Ukraine and Georgia to join the Western Alliance, NATO, but they weren't admitted. Oh, and nor was Macedonia because of a row over a name. All pretty lame, but NATO generals must be cheering at this one. Albania, yes, Albania will be a full NATO member.
This is a miracle of freedoms. Thank you very much.
Having seen all his previous advances towards the West rejected, Putin, the former KGB man, was determined to make a stand. Russia had fired the first warning salvo in 2006. It cut off Ukraine's supply of energy right in the middle of winter. NATO members said it was energy blackmail, but did nothing. Then came Georgia. Russia felt it had to act when Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili shelled and then invaded South Ossetia. Putin felt Russia was being surrounded. The military adventure seemed to be a great success for Russia, as Moscow punished pro-West Tbilisi for trying to join NATO and exposed the West's limp support for its allies in the post-Soviet Legion. Like Georgia, Ukraine's new allegiance with the West is a thorn in Russia's side. Having ruled the country since 1801, the Kremlin is finding it hard to let go, especially as almost 9 million ethnic Russians live there. While most maps identify the Crimean Peninsula as belonging to Ukraine, Russians insist that Crimea is Nash, which means ours. This is the harbour at the port of Balaklava, where the British Empire based its fleet in its war against Russia. The war that included the ill-fated charge of the Light Brigade, the attempt to spike the Russian guns, and that's exactly what NATO would like to do to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which is based at the port of Sevastopol. The Russians still hold a grudge since Ukrainian independence and the Orange Revolution and accuse Kiev of supporting what it calls Georgia's criminal regime.
Russia doesn't like the idea that these two countries have their own direct security relationship with the United States, because Russia still fundamentally thinks that Eastern Europe is its backyard. And of course the paradox about that is the more that Russia says that Eastern Europe is its backyard, the more scared East European countries are, the more they want to get into NATO if they're not in. If they're in NATO, the more they want to be properly defended.
Dick Cheney, the US Vice President, when charging through Russia's so-called near abroad, Georgia, Azerbaijan and Ukraine, trying to bolster support for America. But why do that, except to bait Moscow? Russia's response was to befriend Hugo Chavez and send a war fleet to exercise in Uncle Sam's own backyard, the Caribbean. Will it lead to a new Cold War or a cold peace? And will the latest tension lead to more of the same proxy wars of the past?
Joining me in Moscow is Colonel Dmitry TRENIN and Professor ALEXEI PUSHKOV, as well as Dr. Vyacheslav Nikonov. Colonel TRENIN, I would like to start with you. We just watched a package about Russia's relations with Ukraine and Georgia. Anyone who knows the alphabet of Russian history knows there's a history of love relationship between the Russian people and the Georgian people. What went wrong?
In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian Federation essentially allowed its sister republics in the parlance of those days to choose their own ways and become independent states within the borders, very generous borders that existed at that time within the Soviet Union. I think that the problem was that in so many non-Russian republics, the nation-building process was very much built on the idea that we're no longer part of the empire. We're no longer ruled by the Russians. In the sense that the new nationalisms of several of those states were built very much on, well, shall we say, an anti-Russian sentiment.
And Dr. Nikonov, did Russia try to do anything to attract them back? Because certainly America succeeded in attracting them.
I don't think so. First place that America succeeded in attracting, for example, Ukraine, because now 80% of Ukrainians are against joining NATO. And Yushchenko was supported to be president of Ukraine by the United States because he was really a Ukrainian nationalist who is basing his ideology on anti-Russian principles. So America is playing hardball against Russia.
Then President Putin, today Prime Minister Putin, Professor PUSHKOV, said basically that Russia recognizes the independence and sovereignty of those states like Ukraine and Georgia. And yet, we hear that Russia would not allow those states basically to join NATO. Isn't there a contradiction there?
No, this is all nonsense. Russia cannot allow or not allow. It's up to the Ukrainian people to choose where it will become member of NATO or not.
So you're telling me that NATO could actually be on the borders of Russia?
No, it's not what I'm telling. I'm saying that is it wise for the West to try to drag into NATO a country which historically, culturally is very close to Russia and where the population is against joining NATO? Won't it create a very big crisis between Russia and NATO and the West? Russia cannot allow or not allow, but Russia can say, if you drag Ukraine into NATO against the will of the Ukrainians, there will be a big crisis between the West and Russia, and you have to know it.
Colonel TRENIN, you've said Russia is not America's enemy, but it's not its friend. It's not anti-Western, but it's not pro-Western. How do you describe the American-Russian relations?
The problem is that whereas in the days of the Cold War, there was enmity, but there were rules. In the days of post-Cold War, there was a general feeling of friendship and a lot of rhetoric about partnership. But essentially, the idea was that Russia would play by the rules made elsewhere.
By Western rules?
Well, let's say Western rules. This did not work. You have a clash between American hegemonism and Russian great power ambitions.
And now the United States wants to deploy missile systems in Poland, between Poland and radar systems in the Czech Republic. And Russia can do nothing about it. They've already signed the deal. And Russia feels, I guess, threatened because America keeps claiming this is against rogue states like Iran and North Korea. But Russia is worried, isn't it?
Actually, when NATO was expanded and NATO-Russian Council was created, one of the reasons Russia gave sort of green light to NATO expansion, there was an agreement on three principles. No nukes, no troops, no critical infrastructure for new member states. Of course, fortunately now there are no nukes, but there are more troops, and of course there is more critical infrastructure.
And at the same time, Professor PUSHKOV, and here I want you to explain to me and to our viewers around the world that there is a discrepancy. So America advances towards the Russian borders with missile systems and with NATO expansion. And Russia is basically reducing its generals by 20%, its troops by 10%, and its officers by 1/3, from 400,000 to 250,000.
This is exactly the proof that Russia does not plan any Cold War, any new Cold War with the West, first. Second, our military...
it's not planning, or it can't?
No, it is not planning. Well, you know, I think that Russia right now is not in a position to have a new Cold War with the West. But if the Russian government fixed itself the goal, you know, to start a new Cold War, I think that it could bring some means to have this situation. And also you have to take into account that America is weakened too these days. You know, Iraq, Afghanistan, America is not in a position to have a new Cold War with Russia either. But the Russian military, of course, it was too big in the Soviet times. And it was a very big burden for our economy. So we need to curtail the military, but to make it more efficient. So a smaller army, but a more efficient army. That's, I think, the motto of the day.
We're going to pick up on this and how exactly do Russians view the United States right after the break.